Good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you to Ex Libris today on behalf of the director of the Instituto Cervantes Manchester Leeds, Pedro Jesus Eusebio Cuesta, who couldn't be here today with us. My name is Rosi Song, and I'm a professor of Hispanic Studies at Durham University. Ex Libris is a conversation on recent publications on Hispanic studies by scholars working in British and American academia, covering both Iberian and Latin American studies. Today, we have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Ana Casas Aguilar, author of Bilingual Legacies, Father Figures in Self-Writing from Barcelona, published in 2022 by the University of Toronto Press. Dr. Casas Aguilar is Associate Professor of Spanish at the University of British Columbia, Canada, and her area of research focuses on gender and cultural studies in contemporary Spain, with a particular interest in literature, cinema, and photography. She has published on material culture, objects, and the body in the Spanish-speaking world. And currently, supported by a SSHRC Insight grant, she's working on the topic of tourism in Spain, where she examines the representation of European tourism in Spain and its influence on the construction of gender and regional identities. The project contributes to a growing body of scholarship on European tourism and in the Mediterranean world, and underscores the importance of foreign bodies in shaping notions of masculinity, female sexuality, and regional and national identities. Today, we will be discussing her book, Bilingual Legacies, Father Figures in Self-Writing from Barcelona, where she examines how authors who grew up during Francisco Franco's dictatorship confronted and reconstituted the regime's model of fatherhood and masculinity. The book focuses on the autobiographical works of writers born in Barcelona, including Carlos Barral, Juan Goytisolo, Terence Moix, and Clara Janés. In their works, these writers question the father as an all-powerful and repressive figure firmly at the head of the family. Welcome, Ana, and we're looking forward to discussing your book.
Thank you, Rosi. Thank you for having me here, and thank you for everyone. It's very nice to see so many people I know, and particularly I know it's the end of the term and everyone is quite busy. So many thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you everyone for being here. So let's start with some broad issues that you tackle in your project, and then we'll try to get to the specific examples that you provide in your very thought-provoking book. So can you start by telling us about the origin of Bilingual Legacies and how it departs from contemporary Iberian scholarship that has discussed in the past the legacy of Franco and Francoism as that of an authoritarian fatherly figure, right? One that despite its repressive nature, nonetheless creates an ambiguous relationship with many Spaniards and specifically with writers. And I'm thinking here, for example, outside of the context of Barcelona and Catalonia, about Carmen Martín Gaite, right? So what changes in the context of your study?
Yes, so you ask about the origins of bilingual legacies, and I will say maybe there is more than one origin. One is yes, this quantity or this importance of novels, films, where we see like that were produced at the end of the dictatorship or like the very beginning of the transition, where we find a lot of paternal figures that are either absent or authoritarian. And there has been a reading already of these works. I'm thinking, for example, of Cría Cuervos by Saura. You can also think of Entre Visillos. I don't know if that was what you were thinking, Rosi, when you made the question, but also with El Desencanto, where there are all these paternal presences and kind of the shadow of the father as a very prominent figure. But there is also a bit of a controversy regarding these readings, the readings of these materials, whether we're over reading the father as a dictator or not. And we should say, no, we're talking about real fathers here. This is a novel, but we not necessarily have a metaphor or an allegory of the dictator. So in this context, I was interested in seeing how autobiographies work, because autobiographies are a genre that it's very particular, and where this allegory is very hard to defend because there is the real father. And sometimes there can be Franco as a father figure too, in the case of Goitisolo, but in the other cases, the real father is the really prominent person, and it's a very important figure for the authors to explain why they became writers. So I kind of play a little bit with this idea and move out looking at authors who are working on autobiographies and talking about the real father, and then also authors who are bilingual. And here comes maybe another origin of my book, that it's my own bilingualism and a bit this culture of the incommodity, or like not being 100% happy with two languages, or being questioned about these two languages because of the political weight they carry. And this, in another way, was a personal interest of mine to talk about bilingualism and to talk about a very particular context during the dictatorship. Like, these authors were born just before or after the war. So they grew up in the most repressive moment of Catalan, and then they started writing their autobiographies just when the normalization period of Catalan becoming co-official started. And in many ways, they were questioned, why did you choose a Spanish over Catalan, or why were you writing in both languages? And I thought this question was, to me, always interesting, because they kind of have to give an explanation later of something that happened in their childhood too, like how they became bilingual, how did they experience the languages. And then the third origin, and I'm going to stop here, I don't want to take too much time with this question, but this also a book, Jardín y Laberinto, that it's one of the books I study, that to me was a bit of a hard book to grapple, because it's a book where I came to the work of Clara Janés, the author, from her feminist and her poetry, that it's like erotic poetry, and she has been read as a author who kind of broke with the canon. And then I had read the poetry, and then I go to the autobiography, and then it's just like the father, and I was a bit in shock, because I couldn't quite accept why she was talking so much about the father figure when she was giving so much credit to the father. And then the same happened to me, like the same conflict happened to me with the language, and is that this is a book written in Spanish, but where Catalan is constantly present, and the parts in Catalan in a way are very minimum, like kind of a redact, but in a way, like the most important moments are expressed in Catalan. And I was like, how can this be? And it's also a book that it's kind of an homage to the father, who's a Catalan publisher. So I was, how can a book in Spanish be an homage to the Catalan publisher, and also a book where Catalan is so important? So there were like many things that made me go to this project.
Thank you, Anna. And I think that a lot of these ideas that come to become sort of the origin of your project actually does present a lot of these curiosities, contradictions, situations that are almost impossible to explain. And then, as you said, self-writing and autobiography actually are sort of the genre that centers your project. And as you said, you actually talk about real fathers, right, in your book. Um, and this way of self-writing and the autobiography anchors, right, the work of these writers and the way that you read their work. So, can you actually explain a little bit the background of this genre? Because you actually talk about different waves. You talk about a first and a second and a third wave of self-writing and autobiography, and actually how it lends to psychoanalysis, which is the theoretical framework that helps you elucidate the work of the writers discussed in your book. So, what are the autobiographies, the waves, right, and how it intersects with psychoanalysis?
Yes, so the waves are explained also through like literary criticism as a first wave, where we have autobiography as the life of the important man, the a life that it's worth being written and read. And this is like how autobiography is a little bit born, with this idea of that this is worth being, like, my life is worth being said because I'm already a public figure. I'm already someone who you will be interested in. But then with the second wave of autobiography, what happens is that the criticism goes more towards questioning not whether this is an important person or not, but whether the autobiography as a genre plays actually with reality, or like plays with authenticity. It's like the autobiography is in fact a mask, or another form of fiction that has a particular pact, as Lejeune will say, a particular kind of shaking hands with the reader. And then like this is the framework, the second wave of autobiography and autobiographical criticism that I work mostly, that includes the work of Lejeune, of Laura Marcos, and also of Sidonie Smith, that is also very influential in my work. And then there is a third wave of literary criticism that it's very interested, and with the new media of how, like, it's not anymore autobiography, right? Like, we talk about self-writing, life writing. It's a genre that it's not anymore necessarily that genre. But the 80s and 90s are the moment in which the authors I work on start writing, and the 70s are the moment in which they publish their works, and they call them autobiographies. So I do work with this term and with self-writing too, because they also have a series of texts that are about the self and that are not included to the autobiography. But anyways, the third wave is more interested in the idea of relationality, and to explain more how the subject is actually not independent, but depends on all these other, on the media or on these other persons. But what I found really striking was that autobiography works with two figures, or like the atypical and the narcissistic figure, a little bit as two models that are always presented. The model that looks at himself or herself in the mirror, that's an autobiography, but also the person who kind of needs to do a map of the family and play, like, explain where they are positioned, and in a way also kill the ones before to be born. So that's why I thought like the theoretical framework actually worked really nicely, because there are all these theories on autobiography that say, look, this is a genre where the surname of the father is what give legitimacy to the text, or where the father always appears, like always you have the explanation of who the family is. So it's very interesting to see how the two kind of worked out together, but that was a bit of a coincidence. I was not,
But it works really well because I
it
think
does.
the constant questioning, right? And also the father as a representative figure of language, for
Yeah,
example, that you discuss, it really plays very well into sort of your close reading of
yeah,
your writers.
yes, because that's
Um, yes,
the
go ahead.
the second autobiography wave talks about like in a Lacanian or like
Mm,
Freudian reading, says like this is the merge of the subject, the emergence of the subject in language, right? Like here is where
yeah.
we see the I coming out.
Yeah, and when you have the choice between, or perhaps not the choice, right, between Catalan or in Spanish, and looking back, then what's the choice is actually a very important part of your sort of discussion. So in that sense, language is a really important aspect of this negotiation between self-writing and actually what it becomes to be a very an interesting range of diverse subjectivities, right? Um, and I was interested in one statement that you use concerning the use of languages. In fact, you say, or you use some work that argues that monolingualism is not the norm. In fact, it's the contrary. Multilingualism is the norm, and monolingualism should be understood as a state of privilege and power, actually. So can you explain this idea in more detail, especially for your writers, right, and in the context that you sort of explain and place your project?
Yes, so this idea is not mine. This idea comes from a book called Beyond the Mother Tongue. That it's a beautiful book. I really enjoyed reading it by Yasemin Yildiz, and this she works on bilingual authors in the German context. And the in her autobiography, in her introduction, she speaks a lot about how how the nation states are born, how there is the pressure during the 19th century to make also either a standard language, like in the case of German or Italian, or a monolingual country, to make it merge really with one nation, right? Like the nation state that needs to be also monolingual. But I think we hear all our scholars of languages, and we all know that multilingualism is very common, and that our students come to our classes to learn more languages because they probably already know other languages too. And I think that's a reality we also experience in the case of Spain, right? Like Spain is not a monolingual country, even though if Spanish is the only official language with other co-official languages, but it's like a percentage of the people, an important percentage of the people is not monolingual. So that's where the idea for me was important too, because these authors at some point had to explain something that other authors don't have to explain because of the consciousness of being in a bilingual context. And that was a little bit something that I wanted to state too. Like this is not uncommon. Like it's very common that authors too navigate between many languages.
And I would add a little bit, and perhaps you can expand a little bit on that idea of also not language in the sense of, being multilingual actually is more normal, as you say, right? But also education. What role does education or formal education play in
Yes.
both the learning and acquisition of language?
Yes, so so the authors I work with, Barral, Clara Janes, Juan Goytisolo, and Terence Mosh, were all schooled in Spanish because Spanish was the language of schooling. So I think when they were asked in the 70s, why did you choose one language or the other? In a way, maybe it was an unfair question because unless they had learned, which there were authors who learned Catalan by their own. And in fact, Terence Moix published in Catalan too, and he says, I had to learn it on my own, right? But I think it's important to see this context, that it's very specific, and how it plays a role, how then the family plays a role, because I think they don't feel, or like in a way they think they have to explain through the maternal, paternal lines or the family situation, their choice, like in the case of Carlos Barral saying, my dad, who was the Catalan, died, and I stayed with my mom, who was the Argentine or Uruguayan, or in the case of Goitisolo, the same, my mom, who was the Catalan, died, and I stayed with my dad, who was a Spanish speaker. So they have to kind of explain, put in the family to kind of give not an excuse, but a bit of an explanation of why Catalan disappeared. But Catalan disappeared for political reasons. And in their case, there were also these family coincidences that they use kind of an explanation.
Yes. So let's go back to sort of that family then. In two of the writers that you discuss in your book, Carlos Barral and Clara Llanes, the business of publishing and making books is strongly present, right? Both by inheritance, but also, Barral continues with that in that line of work, right? So, how do you think this family business background has shaped the writers' relationships with their fathers and the languages that these fathers represented? Especially as in both cases, actually, they happen to be fathers who disappear very early in their lives. So, in a way, they were not present in their most formative years, right?
Yes, and in the case of Carlos Barral and Clara Llanes, it's interesting because Seix Barral and Plaza Janés continue to be, like, I always, when I talk to people who are not in the literature milieu, I say, well, but you know Plaza Janés and Seix Barral, and everyone knows these two publishing houses. So it's they really came from families who had a weight in the publishing industry. But all the four authors, in fact, because when I was thinking about this question, I was thinking that Goitisolo is also married to Monique Lang, and she's an editor of Gallimard, and then Terence Moix, the sister, Ana Maria Moix, was an editor for Bruguera. So they are in an environment of books. But in the case of Barral and Llanes, the father is the publisher or owns a publishing house. And that has a very strong implication because they see books all the time as kids. Clara Llanes explains that the father will give the daughters these maquetas, right? Like these blank books so that they will start writing. So there is really a presence of becoming a writer that it's very linked to this inheritance of the father as a publisher. Even though Carlos Barral did inherit the publishing house, but in the case of Clara Llanes, she didn't, because when the dad died, the mom sold it. And but I think in both cases, these two autobiographies, like I loved reading them. One of the reasons was because it's this family account of the publishing industry of Barcelona that it's a little bit rare, right? Like we have a lot of explanations of how the publishing business works from the economic or the like friendship relationships, but not from these familial like kind of inheritance or life. And in the case of Clara Llanes too, she says that this is also in a way for her a weight that it's very hard to carry, like that had, I think, 25,000 books at home. Or in fact, the book Jardín y Laberinto, the quote of Laberinto comes out from a poem from Francis Thompson that the father translated and published. And she remembers the moment in which the father invited all the family for lunch to celebrate that this book came out, right? So it's really all these details that then suddenly she incorporates the father translation into her title, and there she's always trying to find a way to explain that this was really a labyrinth. Like she grew up with this sense of this is a vast and a very male environment of authors, and where am I in between these voices?
Yeah, and also interesting to think that sort of their legacy also continue when they combine with others. So it's not Barral, right? Serge Barral. It's not Janés, it's Plaza y Janés, actually, that you sort of you
Because
pronounce it, right? And it's interesting because it also means that, they needed to incorporate something. They needed something else to survive. I don't know if you thought a little bit about that, or it's just a coincidence.
Well, it's very interesting because in both cases you see the recount of the publishing houses in Barcelona as a completely bad business. Because in the case of Clara Janet, like one of the things she explains is how the father was always trying to deal with banks and had always like a debt, and he was very like it was not an easy business, and it was not a business also that was made economically much sense. And in the case of Carlos Barral, he inherits a publishing house that dedicates itself more to books of schooling, like it's another style, right? And then he turns into a publishing house for literature, like and publishes many of the Latin American authors of the boom. But it's also at the end he also needs to sell it, because it's not like the name of the change of the name Seix Barral comes when the dad dies, and Victor Seix buys the second half, and Carlos Barral works with him. But even at the end of his work, like publishing work, he had to sell the publishing house because it was not a business that was economically good. It was insolvent. It was giving him a debt. So he decided.
Right. And I think that the two anecdotes that you tell in that story is that Barral is the one that turned down Cien Años de Soledad, 100
Yes.
Years of Solitude. And also in the case of Clara Janes, and I think some of our listeners will enjoy this anecdote a lot, was that he would go and flirt with a butcher because he had no money.
Yes.
But in the hope that the butcher would, gift the father pieces of meat,
Yes.
he would flirt and recite poems and so on. So I don't know if it was mortifying for the daughter to find out later, but I thought that anecdote was, it added a very personal touch to sort of that industry, right, that you're telling from the family side of the affair. Yes.
In the case of
So, yeah, go ahead.
In place of Genesis, she records with a cassette the voices of all the women in the family talking about the dad, and like to discover that the dad died when she was 18, and she doesn't know this person, right? Like she doesn't know, like there are also anecdotes on like them driving with Cava, and it's a day of snow, so they put the cava in the snow and say like this way it will be cold when we come back. But then when they come back, there is so much snow that they cannot find the cava, and they are digging into the snow.
The fun moment, right, that you
Yes.
recover through these stories. So those are two fathers that were absent early on, and then you actually have writers like the other writers in the case of Juan Goitisolo and Carlos and Terenci Moix, that are more present, yet at the same time absent in a way, but perhaps physically or intellectually speaking, or sort of as models or for their sons in terms of masculinities or subjectivities and so on. So but in all these cases, both the writers who have lost their fathers at an early age, and also Wojtysola and Terence Mosh, these fathers seem to be both absent and present. And in a way, they create a space or a condition that calls for surrogates. So you're always talking about sort of that replacement or what they're seeking to fill that space with. So I was wondering if you could tell us more about how the surrogates work. You know, what is the need that they provide, or the roles that they play, and what are the relationships that these surrogates enable, right, for these writers.
Yes, so in these two cases, in the case of Juan Goytisolo and Terenci Moix, we have two authors who live like very harshly the fact that they were gay and the father was homophobic. And for example, in the case of Terenci Moix, he says he will hear the father say, "I'd rather have a son dead than gay." And until one of his sons died. And in the same case, in the case of Juan Goytisolo, he also repressed for many years his desire towards men and actually married. And a part of this was that there was this repression in the country, but also at home, right? So I think in both cases, the need for surrogates or for these other models is very important, because in the case of Terenci Moix, the godfather is gay, and this gives him the possibility of having a model of a man who is not homophobic. And in the case of Goytisolo, in a way, Jean Genet, one of the figures that it's kind of a second father or someone he admires, but he also tries to kind of compensate the family, the lack of a family that he likes with an intellectual family that he likes. Or
I
that
would
he,
say,
yeah.
yeah. So I would actually think that in the case of Terence Mosh, you have the Godfather that
Yeah,
shows him a way of living,
yeah.
right? Enjoying life, traveling. It's not. It's rather discreet the way that is described, but certainly is a way of life that is not part of Moshe's reality, but perhaps points to other possibilities. But I
Yes.
think that in the case of Goytisolo, Jean Genet is a different kind of model, right? Because it's more not only lifestyle, but it's more intellectual as well, right? So can you talk a little bit more about in what sense those subjectivities develop, for example, in these two cases? And I was wondering if you could also speak to Goytisolo's eventual role. I mean, he becomes a surrogate father in a way himself, right? Yeah.
Yes, well, in the case of Mosh, one thing that you say about the lifestyle, that there is also to the relationship with the body, right? Or how he sees the masculine body. And one of the things that I work on in my book is how this real father is a physical father too, right? And how do authors describe this physicality? And in the case of Mosh, there is a desire to mock and to make fun, to
Mm.
subvert really the paternal figure. And then with the Godfather is the contrary, is beauty, is strength, is this body that it's that one can desire. And in the case of Goytisolo, I think what you say has to do too with this like like it's like comparing like two poles, right? Goitisolo and Mosh, because Goitisolo has this obsession towards the moral and like being living as one, like with the all the ethics, right? And I think in this sense, Jeanette is he sees it as an ethical model in a way, because it's someone who's not looking to enrich himself, who goes against the currents really without caring. But I was thinking too that these surrogates also exist in a way in the case of Clara Janes, right? Because there you have the Vladimir Holland, that it's the Czech author that she translates and she admires, and it's a paternal figure too that many years after the father died, I think 30 years, tells her, write, like you are born to write, like keep writing. So I think these second or third fathers are there.
Yeah, and especially interesting in the sense of Clara Janes, as you say, because she seems to need to hear that encouragement, right? That she needs to imagine herself as a writer and be told she's a writer,
Yes.
right? So what is the story? How does she become aware of his writing? And it wasn't very clear, do they develop a personal relationship at the end? I mean, you do talk about their sort of age difference, but at some point, and perhaps it is because of the of sort of the gender issue as well, it is a bit ambiguous if this becomes more sort of emotional relationship, or is this more sort of a paternal sort of mentorship kind of situation? How does that play out?
Yeah, Rosie, you're not the first one who asked me this question. Everyone is like, you know what really happened? Is like, I have no idea. Like I can suspect things, but yes, with Vladimir Holland, like she visits him. There is a very strong kind of admiration, and then she learns Czech and translates Czech. And Clara Janes is one of the translators of Czech to Spanish, right? That we know. I think what I find interesting here is that these need to have a masculine figure to say, yes, you can do it. And in the case of Janice, it happens three times. It happens with the father. Then there is a moment in Catalan too that one of the uncles tells her, "Tu has aconseguit, like you made it." And she says this is the moment in which she realizes that she's an author, that she's
Mhm.
recognized as someone who writes. And then in the case of Vladimir Holland too, right, that pushes her to and with Holland it's like a merge of doing the mourning towards the father many years after, like saying goodbye to the father, and also starting a new life and acknowledging that this death has happened and that she needs to move forward.
Mhm. Because she carries that weight of her dead father for a long time, it
Yes,
seems.
yes,
Yeah.
she's like at the beginning of Jardín y Laberinto, right? That it's published. So the father died in 59, and I think Jardín y Laberinto is published like 30 years later. So it does
Mm.
mean like she's working all the time on this text for many
Mhm.
years, but only like the final product comes out many years after.
So speaking about sort of that encouragement to write, or
Uh-huh.
perhaps that comes through, sort of role modeling, but also kinship. One of the other writers present in that story is Ana Maria Mosch,
Mhm.
actually, Terenci Mosch's little sister, who
Yes.
was actually quite a writer and quite a prodigy, right? Vasquez Montalban thought that she was almost a genius, right? Did you discover something about their relationship, or had more insight about how they develop both as writers in a household that actually, again, I think that the father as a person did not quite represent that intellectual sort of weight that it seemed that that father figure played more in the older families.
Mhm.
You know,
Yes,
because we think about the father as the mechanic with the dirty hands and so on, right?
yes, and in the case of Goitis Moish, the relationship between the siblings is also nice because they were very close together, right? And they will read and write and help each other, and it's a very like kind of yeah, like fraternal really relationship. And I found it very interesting. I did not include it in the book, but I found very interesting reading Julia in relationship to Terence Mosh autobiographies, right?
Mm.
Because there you see a lot of how the autobiographer, like the Mosh decides to portray the father as out in the autobiography, but it's in a way the same father. Like there are many resemblances with Julia, uh,
Mhm.
with the father in this novel, and that I found very interesting because they are like kind of speaking to each other
Mhm.
all the time. So I think there is a more work to do there that I haven't done with
Yeah,
all
definitely.
of how, in fact, these books, these autobiographies are very correlated to many other works, right? In the case of Goitisolo, the two other brothers also write. And also there have just appeared now a movie by the granddaughter. Like you
Mhm.
can do a very complex map of all the things that are happening.
Yeah, that sort of that genealogy would be very
Yeah.
interesting to put together, right? I
Mhm.
think that, and at some point when you read or when you discuss Goitisolo, I do like the way that you use Luis Goitisolo's Antagonía as sort of a counterpoint,
Yeah.
right, to El Coto Vedado and Los Reinos de Taifa. And actually, they do complement each other because
Yeah.
they provide each other puzzles, right, or answers to certain family puzzles, right?
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
and I do think, and the same with Esther Tusquets, right? Like there were
Mm,
other authors that I thought about including, and they also have like the daughter is a writer, the mother is a writer, the like they're like also in the Barcelona context, the brother of Esther Tusquets is an architect. Like they have all these entramado of
mm.
people that are kind of present and that you could relate all these books between them through all these family relationships.
Yeah. So much work to be done.
Yes.
So I'm going to be asking my last question. So at this moment, I'd like to invite our friends who are with us today to either start typing your questions in the chat box or open your mics and your videos and just jump in whatever you want. So while they get warm up, while they warm up their questions or prepare their questions, and I'm gonna ask you one last question, and it has to do with politics. I think that it's unavoidable to talk about politics when we talk about the Catalan language. Um, and actually, your project helps us see some of its most salient contradictions, right, between these sort of these antagonistic positions that these languages play at each other, while there's part of sort of the same as well, right? So especially these contradictions when it comes to the way these authors actually use and write in, right, Catalan and sort of the literary expression both in Spanish or in Catalan and so on. So, what are today the ongoing struggles from sort of this perspective? So, I guess the question is, after the normalization of Catalan, after the dictatorship, could experiences of writers like that of Goitisolo, Barral, Moix, and Janes be repeated? And I'm also thinking from this context, I'm thinking about really the fast changing Catalan society, given today's migratory movements, that, you know, in a way are challenging and expanding national linguistic borders today, right? So perhaps you can think if those experiences will be repeated in a similar fashion today, Or if not, how do you see Catalan literature evolving or expanding in the next, let's say, 2 decades? This is a bit of a complicated question, but you don't have to take too long. I'm sure that we have friends who want to ask more questions.
When I saw your question, Rosie, and I say, if I have time, I'm going to ask you this. And it was like, okay, if you have time, that means you don't want you want me to take a lot of time with the other things. And, so there are many things that I can say. So first, these were authors that were kids during the 40s and 50s in Spain when Catalan was forbidden. Like I have in my book some recollection of the books that were published in Catalan. For example, in 1944, 5 books. In 1962, 270. And I say this history of publishing in Catalan a little bit to see how the repression towards the language changed and what they were probably living when they were kids, right? And this is not the case today. Like we don't have this, but that doesn't mean that the languages are still not politicized, and that the languages don't have that. It's something that I find very interesting, like a connotation for certain people. Like I think Moix is very funny at saying Catalan was the language of the street, of the things that are very low, and Spanish was the language of the things that were very high, no? And this kind of diglossia, or this kind of weight that languages may have, still in some ways remains. But I do think that it has changed a lot. And like in my case, I feel very lucky that I did all my schooling in Catalan, even though I know that to me, Spanish was a language related to literature, maybe more than Catalan, and I was in a way still inheriting these ideas, right? But then it's funny because having come to Canada, I have also put things a little bit on perspective. When I had this meeting with a group of indigenous kids that were visiting the town where I was. And I say like, oh, my language is also a minority language. And then they ask me, oh, how many speakers? And I say like, I think 10 million. And they were like, yeah, but like we're 50. Like it's in the Canadian case, I was looking, I think, Cree, that it's the language that has more speakers, has 100,000, right?
Mm.
So I think it's like sometimes it's interesting too, because I did grow up, or I did have around a little bit this discourse of Catalan is dying, Catalan is an endangered language. And in a way, it's true. Like it's a language that doesn't have the strength that the Spanish has, right? And many authors might continue to publish in Spanish because it sells more books than in Catalan, right? Or many people read more in Spanish than in Catalan. That there are still parts that are not really in equilibrium. But I think having like also like being abroad has made me think that Catalan is also in a way in a very healthy state.
Now that's really put things into perspective. I love your story about the children's question to you. How many people speak it?
He's like, oh, we're many. It was very embarrassing. It's like, we're endangered too.
So I'd like to invite our friends to ask questions. Please open your cameras, your mic, if you want, or use the chat box. Do I see anyone? We actually have a few people. I don't see any hands. Yeah, and just jumping on that question, actually, they also seem to have an amazing archive, right? But I also feel that Esther Tusquets wrote a little bit too late, so once she starts remembering, that's when all the interesting things start coming out. But that doesn't happen until a little bit later than a lot of these writers that you study.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, but anyway, do we have any other questions? We perhaps have time for one more question. if I see any hands. If not, I will ask one more question. So I think that everybody's very shy today. But having written this book and moving on to the topic of tourism, do you see any connections between this project and your next project? And I see that Guillem is smiling because I know that you guys are working on this somehow together as well. But what are
This
the connections that you see, or how are you moving this experience and this amount of knowledge that you have accumulated through this project into your next project?
Yeah, so the project on tourism came out of actually the autobiographies of Carlos Barral, right? And he was at some point like was in politics and did Ley de Costas to protect. Like he was obsessed with Calafell, this town that where the father had a house and where he had like kind of contact with the seawall. And to me, the point that I was like, oh, this is what I want to maybe do next too, was how he has this discourse about protecting the environment, and yet there is this objectivization of tourist women, right? And he has actually a novel that it's an autofiction that it's him with a tourist, and I thought that was to me interesting, right? Like how there was this sense in a way of protecting from tourists, but in another way there was this desire
For the other,
for the
this
other.
very, yes.
Yes,
But
and
now that you mentioned Barral's fiction, do you like Barral's fiction? Do you think he was a good novelist?
so the novel I didn't like that much, that one, but maybe as as a poet, what do you think, Rosie?
I don't know. I think I stopped at the self-writing. That's what I'm asking. I wasn't brave enough to go into his fiction. So that is why I'm asking this question. And I hope there are no Barral fanatics in this conversation today. We like Barral. He's done a lot of good work, but I'm not very familiar with his fiction.
This was like I read his poetry mostly, and I
Mm,
do like his poetry. And this work of autofiction was quite late.
mm.
Was quite late, and then other works that I thought that were interesting but not really literary is that he has all this series of books, Catalunya des del Mar y
Mm.
Catalunya, no sé si és a vol d'ocell, and where he writes in Catalan, but those are books more of like kind of glossary.
Yeah,
Uh,
and travel,
yes,
landscape, yes. And in
photography.
the go
So it's
ahead.
photography mixed with his, so it's really another